Meagaria. Creating a huge Bulgaria, also called Meagaria, is often banned in multiplayer due to Bulgaria gaining an insane spirit that allows you to gain way too much compliance. In a perfect access scheme, Bulgaria gets virtually all of the land they occupy, builds up compliance, and then starts putting their territory on harsh quotas, which will result in factories being spawned in out of thin air. So you will get like 130, 140, 150% of the factories in that land. This is even stronger considering that Bulgaria has quite good MIOs and production modifiers. So Bulgarian mills are better than most Axis mills, they are better than Spanish mills for sure, better than Finnish mills, and shit like that. I'm not sure, I think they're slightly worse than German mills, but other than that, Bulgaria has pretty much the best mills in the Axis. Cancelling MEFO builds. As you may know, Germany has two ecopaths. The right side of the German ecopath struggles a lot with consumer goods due to the MEFO build spirit slowly increasing consumer goods. But there is a way to circumvent this. If you cancel your MEFO builds right after unlocking your Institute price controls decision, and then you click all of them right after canceling it, you basically move the entire downside or remove the entire downside of picking the right side eco tree, which is that you will have high consumer goods in the late game, like absurdly high consumer goods, you know? And then you have to click like the gold decisions and shit like that. But by canceling MEFO builds, you just circumvent that completely, resulting you into having some absurd scaling into the late game. So this has obviously have to be banned for that reason. Because if it isn't, Germany can, you know, just build mills deep into the late game, go high on air gamble, and pretty much outproduce the allies. No garrison trolling. If you're playing the British Raj, France, or any other country that controls non-core territories that your enemy has to occupy, you can put that territory on no garrisons as the game begins, or later in the game, 30, 37, 38, depending on whenever your enemy invades. Then, once your enemy later walks into the territory, he will take insane penalties. These penalties include insane attrition losses and not being able to strategically redeploy. So let me give a more specific example. You play as Raj, and you know that Japan has to invade over land route, typically, if you are guarding your ports properly. Then you put Myanmar, you put that on no garrison, and then you let Japan invade or go through that, and as they go through that, they take insane casualties, and they can't really fight you then, because while being in that 100% resistance territory, they just lose half or more of their equipment by just walking towards you. And once they arrive, you can pretty much just click them back. You can overrun them, and they can't really do much because they can't even stretch redeploy back. So they're just fucked. So for obvious reasons, this is banned in multiplayer. GBP expats. When sending troops as expeditionaries to another country, it always uses the doctrine of the country that is sending the troops. That is for all but one stat, planning. Incidentally, that is also the main strength of ground battle plan. So creating divisions with superior firepower or mobile warfare and then sending them to someone else who uses GBP allows you to essentially combine two doctrines, which is incredibly broken and has to be banned. Always engage patrol submarines. When putting subs in stacks of one, always engage and patrol, they will immediately engage any fleet crossing that sea zone. When engaged in a naval battle, fleets take a lot of fuel. So by doing this, you can easily prohibit nations to move their fleets basically anywhere. And with fleets, I specifically mean their surface fleets, obviously. And if they do that, you can quickly force them to run out of fuel, which creates perfect conditions for you to engage later. So not only is this very cancer in multiplayer, but also very overpowered. So this just has to be banned. And if it isn't, I encourage you to abuse this, especially as like Germany, Italy, Japan. Like you can really create a hard game for the allies if you abuse that. Civ boosting. Some nations have better modifiers for their civs, and others have worse ones. The best example for this is the USA. Their civs are virtually useless in the early game, to the point where you usually build infrastructure instead of civs or mills, because your civs just have so bad modifiers on mills and civs. But you can easily circumvent this by trading a lot with nations that use their civs in a useful way. Usually that would be the UK, and a bit later, once they get war economy, the Soviets. If you allow this, it creates a huge economic imbalance toward their allies, which screws over game balance big time, which is why it's usually banned. Supremacy spam. Fleets only have so many uses, and one of them is naval invading. But to invade, you need naval supremacy. But due to supremacy working in a silly way, the best thing to to build to prohibit your enemy from naval invading are empty carriers. This is not universally banned. In some rule sets it's allowed, but in most lobbies it is. Because, allowing this just creates repetitive and boring gameplay due to virtually just like most nations that do navy being incentivized to just ignore building a navy and spamming out carriers. Like typically Japan would just, spam out like 8-9 carriers or more, like depending on how many docks they have. It's just not fun, and and obviously if you do this, you want to avoid naval battles at all costs, and you just want to abuse your supremacy to deny the enemy of naval invading or just invading yourself. CAS farmers. AA shoots down enemy CAS planes. CAS planes are very expensive but necessary for the game's balance. The allies, for example, need CAS in order to push the axis, because CAS gives like 30% stats roundabout, sometimes a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less. And additionally to the stat modifier that you get for your attack and breakthrough, you also gain the actual CAS damage, which is also quite significant, or at least can be. So it is necessary for the game balance, but if you stack your divisions with loads of AA, you shoot down the enemy CAS way too fast and efficiently, which will make the game very silly and slow to play. The way you do this is you create like a unit with just a little bit of orc and defense, and you put it in a tile, but since it has very, very low orc and defense, it will basically never reinforce first, or start in the battle. That will be your other unit, and then you have it in your reserves. But here's the trick: AA in reserve still shoots down planes, but you don't lose AA because you are in the reserves. So that is the trick behind this. Your super high AA units are not actually in the front line losing AA, but they're sitting in the back shooting down the enemy CAS at absurd rates, because AA trades IC-wise very positively against enemy CAS planes, because a CAS plane costs like 30 IC, and AA costs like 4 IC or less, and 1 AA usually shoots down, or like maybe like 2 or 3 AA pieces usually shoot down a CAS piece. Wall tension spiking. Some countries, typically mainly the allied ones, scale a lot. Their bottleneck for how much they can scale early on is typically the wall tension. It is supposed to slowly go up, but some nations like the Soviets have methods of creating a lot of wall tension very quickly, by justifying on big nations like the US, or even by creating and dismantling factions again and again. The biggest problem in allowing this would be that the US gains absurd amounts of production early on, because as said earlier, the US mills are supposed to suck for like the first 2 or 3 years. And if you allow this, also it's not just the US, I must say, it's also the Soviets to some extent, but bigger is it for the UK and some Commonwealth nations like Australia and also France. So basically every allied nation profits from higher wall tension. Not every Axis nation does though. So if you allow this, the game will just be way too one-sided and like a complete allied stomp. Mainland France hold. If the entirety of the allies try to hold the French mainland in 1939, there's simply no chance of the Axis ever breaking that. The game is simply way too one-sided for that. At least not in any reasonable amount of time. Allowing this makes all games end in 1939 or 1940. If you have UK air with a US land lease, if possible, you have mass mob of the British Raj, of South Africa, of Australia, maybe even of Brazil, depending on what lobby you play, and then you have French tanks. There's just no shot the Axis ever breaks this, and for obvious reasons, therefore it has to be banned.